Health is a subject that matters to each of us. I mean, those in good health, we want to stay that way. Those battling their health issues want the best care. And those who advocate for others are looking for answers and the best path to follow in a complex system. Each time I brought a health professional on the show, I realized that they internalize how failing health can rip away all we know and value, and even our time on this planet, and how dedicated they are to trying to make us feel and ideally heal better. Sometimes my healthcare guests are both practitioners and the patient. I mean, David Fagenbaum. If you haven't listened to that episode, he was given his last rites twice, dying from an incurable disease, and he had to find his own cure. Stephanie Strathy, an infectious disease specialist. Ironically, her husband gets infected by an antibiotic-resistant superbug that's absolutely taking away his life. And through her dedication, they uncover a century-old cure that saves his life. Other times, they try to move healthcare in the future. Dr. Jean Marmorillo, in her 70s, signs up to be a maid doctor to help people in extreme pain end their life with dignity. Emmanuel Taban came from extreme poverty in the Sudan. He's captured by rebels and tortured. He finds a way to become a doctor, and he becomes world-renowned as a pulmonologist with his groundbreaking cures for COVID-19. Dr. Alika LaFontaine, first Indigenous doctor to be president of the Canadian Medical Association, takes what he learns from working with his people and with limited resources. In doing so, tries to encourage all of us to do more healthcare with less. Well, my guest today is Dr. Brian Goldman.
I came out of medical school with the impression that if I memorized everything and knew everything, or as much as possible, as close to everything as possible, that it would immunize me against making mistakes. And it worked for a while, until I met Mrs. Drucker, a wife, a mother, and a grandmother. They say you never forget the names of those who die, and that was my first time to be acquainted with that.
He's one of those rare individuals who's found success in not one, but several adrenaline-pumping careers. Highly regarded emergency physician at Mount Sinai Hospital, one of Canada's top medical commentators. He's the host of CBC's award-winning radio show White Coat, Black Art, where he takes listeners behind the scenes of hospitals and doctors' offices. And he's a host of the podcast The Dose on current affairs in healthcare.
This is Chatter That Matters with Tony Chapman, presented by RBC.
Brian, welcome to Chatter That Matters.
Hi, Tony. Glad to be speaking with you.
So in our pre-interview, I asked you the best way to describe yourself. And I have to say, of all the answers I've received to date, and it's over 200 episodes, yours is among the best, if not the best. So give us a sense of how you like to be thought of and known.
A wise person once told me a long time ago that if you can't be the best, be different. So one thing I strive for is to be different because I can't compete with the best. I also hate competing, even though I'm a very competitive person. In the work that I do, whether I'm speaking to somebody in the emergency department, often they have mental health challenges, or I'm doing an interview for White Coat Black Art, I want them to say something different. I want to get them off their prepared script. I think a lot of journalists would say, well, that's what I do too. One of the ways that I do it is by listening carefully. Because I think that people do want to talk about themselves, and they want to reveal themselves. They want to be seen. And if you follow the breadcrumbs, you'll get to the place where they feel comfortable. Like, that look in somebody's eyes when somebody says, there's a look that says, I've been waiting for somebody to ask me that question for 30 years. And you finally asked it. Now I get to talk about it.
What advice? Because I think today we're so frantic to get to the next bit and bite, this snackable content. And I see people just scrolling like mad on Instagram. What advice can you offer to people in terms of the magic that can be found when you just pause and dive a little deeper, go beneath the surface, as you say, that to follow those breadcrumbs?
What I'm sharing is not me leading and telling people what to do, but reflecting on my own struggles. And you said something really penetrating there. You said, get to the next. If you're getting to the next, that means you're constantly anticipating what's next. And what are you missing out on? You're missing out on what is at the moment. That's directly connected to my own personal struggles of either living in the regretful past, what I woulda, coulda, shoulda done, or living in the worried future. You can't dwell in either place. You have to live in the moment. That's the only moment you have. And yet and that's my struggle. That's my eternal life struggle. So just as I've learned to breathe, I'm hoping I'm going to write a book on my personal struggle with insomnia, because I've had a multi-decade struggle with insomnia. And we'll get to the implications of that insomnia on a major career shift. But the point is, one of the things I've learned in helping my problems with insomnia is that when I'm lying in bed, I just breathe and concentrate on my breathing. I will reach a count of 6 or 7 and then out 6 or 7. And when you concentrate on your breathing, you're no longer concentrating on hearing a bit of music and having it play in your brain as an earworm, or worrying about something that you didn't do, thinking you got to do something. And that ties directly into your question, to what you're asking me about waiting to hear what somebody's going to say. You don't know what they're about to say unless they're heavily scripted and you're heavily scripted. Just yesterday, I was planning, one of my producers and I are going to be going off to Hamilton to interview a young man with colon cancer. And the whole focus of the show is that young men and women can get colon cancer despite what doctors believe. And I found that his script was a bit more heavily scripted than it needed to be. Like he was asking questions, expecting a certain answer to be spat out. And I said to him, let's make the questions a bit more vague, a bit more open, and leave a little room for mystery. That delicious thing that somebody tells you something that they didn't think they were going to tell you, and you didn't think you were going to hear, and now you have to deal with it. And that's the best part of interviewing.
You remind me in some ways of Larry David. And I'll tell you why. Because Larry David is really one of the most insightful human beings in the moment. He created a show with Jerry Seinfeld, a show about nothing, which was about everything. It was about life. But at the same time, when you listen to Larry David talk about his life, he's often talking about overcoming his insecurities or the things that he felt held him back. I'm wondering if there's a parallel there, that when you do take the time to reflect on your journey and to recognize that these are obstacles to overcome, does that make you more equipped to be in the moment and in the present?
He's wicked. He's arch. Some people think he's mean. But, and that's the risk. That's the risk that goes with going for authenticity. But he's, in his own inimitable way, he's going for moments of authenticity where people actually drop the mask and just reveal themselves. I didn't start out my career striving for that. But it became obvious that was my shtick. That's what I like to do. That's when I feel like I'm alive. I need to feel when I'm doing an interview that I have gotten something that the producers who are working with me, who are very talented, would not necessarily have gotten. And sometimes their jaws drop because they didn't think that somebody would go to a place and talk about something so intimate. I interviewed a nurse practitioner who works in a library, the Stanley Milner Public Library in Edmonton. And this is in the downtown core, surrounded by homeless people who use fentanyl, who are dying of fentanyl overdoses, who live in precarious housing. A pilot project, always a pilot project. They got some funding to put nurse practitioners and social workers in the library, because that's, the library is the last place where homeless people who use drugs, people who have severe mental health issues can feel they have a right to be there. You can get kicked out of almost any other place, including the emergency department at some point, if they think you're using the ER for, if the staff there think you're using the ER for a sandwich and a warm place, to stay on a cold night, perish the thought. Anyway, I'm talking to the nurse practitioner, and it's going to be a standard interview about what she does, and I'm going to make rounds with her. She's going to run around the library. She's going to be seeking out people in crisis. She's going to be called, to the stacks or to the reference desk because there's somebody who's sitting by themselves and they're beginning to talk to themselves, and maybe there's a mental health issue with them. All magnificent stuff. But when it came to interviewing her, there's why does she do what she does? It turns out that her father had substance use and died in an intensive care unit. We went there. We went to her talking about that, and her voice started to quiver, and she was talking, and this was her mission. Nobody knew until she said, she just muttered something, and I just picked up on what she muttered, and we went there. And it became a really important part of the show because not only do I want to hear people's exploits, what they do to make healthcare better, their hopes, their dreams, their frustrations, whatever, and patients too. But I want to know what makes them tick, because what makes them tick tells you why they do what they do. That's the engine of their life, just as it's the engine of my life.
So let's talk about that, because my show is all about human journeys, and I always call it the hero's journey, that people have to go through life. They have to battle headwinds. Sometimes they have to overcome the most horrific circumstances, but at times they defy all odds. They get to reclaim or chase their dreams. They find a new mission in life. Where did yours come from? I mean, I was looking back at a couple of defining moments of your life, and maybe just wind the clock back to how did this empathetic Brian Goldman get there? Because from what I understand at the beginning, you weren't necessarily, you had an intellectual firepower, but I don't think your heart had quite caught up yet.
No, I think that's fair. I think that if you'd asked me why I went into medical school, for instance, I would have said that's where my cohort of smart kids went. I remember in either, grade 12, we had grade 13 at the time. One of my classmates, Sherry Yaffe, said in the middle of the class that Brian Goldman would study for a blood test.
Yeah.
Like I was the expression was a browner.
Yeah.
A geek, a nerd, or something like that. But I was a browner, and that was all I was known for. I was known for studying hard. One of the reasons why I studied hard was because I was a social misfit. I was the youngest and the shortest, and now I'm not the youngest anymore. I'm the oldest in my one of the oldest of my cohort in the emergency department and at the CBC. It reinforced this inferiority complex that I had. And I was lonely. And, in many respects, I still am. Except now I know I'm lonely. And instead of acting out my loneliness, I feel it, because if you feel it, then you feel better. And then you begin to discover, and if you breathe and, if you live in the moment, you discover the other people who are lonely too. And you discover who your friends are and who your true friends are. And I'm just, and I'm dealing with that for a couple of reasons. My sister died, almost 14 months ago. She was one of my best friends. And then I found out of the blue just recently in the last 6 weeks or so that one of my oldest friends who had moved away, and, we had infrequent contact over the last 5 years. He'd become a bit of a recluse. He died suddenly of glioblastoma, the same thing that struck Gord Downey, the Tragically Hip. He had a brain tumor, and he died 6 weeks later. And it leaves you feeling bereft. But that, that's a digression. To get back to your question, I was a guy who studied hard because I was lonely. I was going to do what smart people did. I knew I wasn't going to be a surgeon. I didn't have the manual dexterity. I certainly wasn't going to be an orthopedic surgeon. So I was probably going to be an internist. And then I thought I'm going to be a neurologist. And then it was going to be a pediatric neurologist. And I was planning my career from the top down. Boy, what a ridiculous piece of advice, because that doesn't give you any room to kind of smell the roses or the coffee or whatever. But I had planned it to the point that I was going to go to Johns Hopkins and do a 2-month elective in neurology, a 1 month of adult neurology and 1 month of pediatric neurology, and impress my would-be mentors there, and have them want to say yes to me if I applied to their residency program. And eventually I did go on a residency tour in the United States, and that's what I was going to do, because that's smart kids went to the United States. There you can make it big. You can make it big anywhere. So I was at Johns Hopkins, and I hated almost every minute of it.
And why's that?
I had finally met my match in a cohort of smarty pants people who If I spend all of my time studying, if I used 18% of my brain, they used 19 or 20% of their brains, and they could outdo me in memorizing facts and figures. And I just felt like I didn't belong in their culture. That was one of my first exposures to a strong medical culture where doctors are superheroes and they have no problems with sleep deprivation and food deprivation and bathroom deprivation. They just, they save lives and they only do good stuff. And the flip side of that is that they are ultra, ultra, ultra defensive and ultra sensitive to criticism. To me, one of my salvations is that I discovered that I can be criticized and live. And actually grow stronger from it. But my colleagues don't know. They still don't know that. It's just incredible how prickly and how brittle they are in the face of criticism. And I had insomnia at that time, which said medicine wasn't for me, but I persisted because one of the things I cannot do is let go of things. It's my Achilles heel. Like Diana and the golden apples, I keep collecting things I'm supposed to be doing, and I have a really hard time letting go of them. Instead of waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning, I was waking up at 4 every morning and getting more and more sleep deprived and more depressed and more grumpy until the day when I was supposed to present grand rounds in the Department of Neurology. Guy McCann is the hotshot neurologist. He's in charge. I'm going to impress him. I got up at about 3:30 or 4, had a quick pee, went back to bed, and fell into the deepest sleep that I had had in months. I woke up just as rounds were supposed to be beginning, the ones that I was supposed to present. And so I'm a no-show at the rounds I'm supposed to present. I got up, I got dressed as fast as I could. I ran across the street to Johns Hopkins Hospital, climbed the flights of stairs as fast as I could, out of breath, and stood at the back of the room like Dustin Hoffman in The Graduate. Elaine, like it's too late. And that's that's a medical student's nightmare. That's a dream, a recurring dream that I have. And my nemesis, the senior resident who was there, who hated me, probably because I reminded him of himself, but he didn't know why he hated me. He looked and had this malevolent grin on his face. And he said, I still remember him. I can remember how he said it and the words he used. It's okay, Brian. You're too late. Everybody broke out in laughter. It was the worst moment of my life, right up there with the humiliation of the day that I got the strap, corporal punishment from a principal, a public school principal. Soon after, the elective was finished, I went back to Toronto and had to rethink my entire life. I sank into a depression. It took several years for me to come out of it. I was signed up to do an internship in sick kids in pediatrics. First step in becoming a pediatric neurologist. That was gone. After the first few months of doing pediatrics, I did pediatric neonatal intensive care unit, and I was ready to quit medicine at that point. I certainly didn't want to continue the residency. And so I switched over back to internal medicine, which was like reaching back to something that I was good at, but I didn't want to be I didn't want to be an internist. Not at all. I mean, this is incredible. I think all the time I put into this, the lifeline for me, the ticket out, was that in my internship year, I started to write a novel that I never finished. But I discovered that I loved writing, and it was a solitary pursuit. I could be inside my own head. And then as I switched from pediatrics to doing a year of internal medicine, I took a continuing ed weekend course in how to get your writing published. And I turned that course into my first sale for the Globe and Mail. I decided, since I didn't know what I wanted to do with my postgraduate medical career, somebody suggested to me, I had friends who were moonlighting in the emergency department, and they said you should give it a try. And I did. And I discovered that it suited me and I suited it. I left residency at the end of that second year. This is 1982. It's a long, long time ago. I started to do two things. I worked shifts in the emergency department in a hospital in suburban north of Toronto in a suburb called Richmond Hill. And eventually 2 years later, I started working at Mount Sinai Hospital, where I just celebrated 40 years. In parallel, I wrote. one article after another, newspapers and magazines. I became a contributing editor to the Canadian Medical Association Journal. And then 1986 in the fall, I took a course in radio documentary writing at what is now Toronto Metropolitan University, and turned that into my first sale for the CBC. And really, in many respects, I've never looked back. And radio has been my medium since then.
So a couple of things I want to unpack in what you said is that a lot of times when you get hit with a sledgehammer, in this case, obviously, as you said, it took years to recover. I fell into a depression. A lot of people are battling some horrific headwinds right now. And my hypothesis and why I do this show is that this overpowering negativity that we're inhaling every day is manifesting this growing sense of impossibility. And people are just feel like the cement's just pouring up their legs and there's just no point going forward. How did you turn around what to me would be one of the crisis moments of your life? Sleeping in and missing your shot, that one shot that Eminem talks about. What advice can you give to others who are going, there's no point going forward? I had my hand on that rung and I fell off the ladder and I just don't have it in me anymore to reach.
I say this with a bit of trepidation because I have abilities and I have privilege, and I had privilege back then that made it easier, that cushioned the blow and made it easier for me to contemplate doing other stuff. I'm also a very practical person. It's not either or. And you should never think in terms of the whole dream is gone or the whole dream is alive and well. It could be something in between. And my survival instinct said, as I left residency to pursue this fledgling dream to write, I'm going to hang in medicine long enough to be able to earn a living doing it so that I could subsidize myself writing. And, I think some of my emergency colleagues would be horrified. Well, some of them would say, yeah, we knew it all the time, Brian. You just dabbled in emergency medicine so that you could write about it. But the point is that it's not all or nothing. It's not that the dream is alive or the dream is dead. Maybe in the same way that, some of the employment experts or retirement specialists who teach you, try to counsel you on how to have a good retirement, which is also an important transition, that you cultivate interests, multiple interests, just as you have multiple sides of yourself. And what those can do, they may become a job. They may become your primary occupation, or the job that you trained for may become an avocation instead of your primary source of income. And you have to be flexible in that way. And I've always been flexible. And one of the things I learned, I summarized my freelance career very, very quickly. One of the important survival tactics that I've used over the years is to have multiple streams of income and to not ever be dependent on one thing. So I promised myself early on, I would never be an employee. I don't want to be, alive or dead professionally at the behest of a company or at the whim of a company. There's a core thing that I want to say for people who feel stuck. The first thing you have to do when something horrible happens in your life, and I hate to say this, but it's true, is to feel the pain. You have to feel the pain. You cannot make excuses for it. They were lousy, or, they didn't appreciate the true me. At some point, you have to feel it in your bones, in your heart, and in your soul, the disappointment, the deep disappointment that you feel. An Olympic athlete who trains for years and years and years and then has a terrible injury just before the Olympics, or has their shot at it and it's gone. You cannot explain it away. You have to cope. You have to rise above it. And some of that may be kind of chasing some of the negative thoughts, but you do have to experience the disappointment if that's what you feel, and not the more you block it, the more you push it away, the harder it comes at you and inhabits your dreams, your nightmares.
And the other question that I wanted to ask, because it really bridges your medical profession and your gift as a storyteller, is this TED Talk you did, Doctors Make Mistakes, and at least one of your episodes in The Dose calling for more whistleblowers to come out.
Yep.
And I'm curious as to why you decided to openly talk when you're obviously working alongside other professionals. Did you ever feel blowback from them that sort of said, he's not really here to practice medicine or have my back. He's really here to expose the flaws in the healthcare system. Those were two of many courageous statements you've made to say, hey, we're not perfect. We're not like the guy that stood at the front of the room with the grin saying, you're too late, Brian. We're human beings and you can expect all the warts that come with being human.
Yeah. I think that, have I had people who've objected? Yeah. From time to time. Individuals don't do that. Occasionally, I had one colleague who thought that, my self-confessional about my mistakes in the TED Talk was well suited to the age of Oprah Winfrey, to the age of people sitting on a couch and talking to a famous interviewer about their flaws and about their foibles and their mistakes. But that person I'm thinking of is a bit of an exception. I found over the years that more people appreciated the open invitation to reflect on their own mistakes in a less self-crucifying way. Like I'm a terrible person because I make mistakes. I didn't know it at the time, Tony. I became interested subsequent to that TED Talk in the phenomenon of toxic shame, the Brene Brown kind of toxic shame, this primordial fear that if anyone discovered how flawed you were, the mistake you just made, they would ask you to leave, exclude you from the group. That is a preeminent fear of a lot of healthcare providers. So they don't want people to learn about their mistakes. They're not dishonest people. They're just terrified of being outed and discovered. If they were, they think they would be kicked out. That's obviously a cousin of the famous imposter syndrome that people feel like they're just waiting for to be the tap on the shoulder, the finger that says, you don't belong here. It's time for you to leave. For me, why did I do that? I did it because, what started as a TED Talk, what ended as a TED Talk started as a series of speeches that I gave. And they all began in exactly the same way. I don't know how you're going to react to this. Because it was novel, because people didn't talk about their mistakes. It left you the impression that doctors never make mistakes. For me, I talk about being a kind of a brazen medical resident, that in that year of internal medicine in which I sent a patient home, I treated their heart failure, sent them home. It was at a time when we didn't have some of the tools for quickly diagnosing and the method for quickly diagnosing whether somebody was having a heart attack without the obvious signs of a heart attack on the electrocardiogram. And I sent the patient home. I did so without talking to my attending cardiologist, who would have had a completely different view. He would have said, no, you shouldn't do that. And I know that because he said so. And after the fact, also, the other mistake that I made was not listening to a little voice in my head and my heart, which was trying to tell me that's not a good idea. So I did both. I went back to the rest of my cardiology duties. That was the rotation I was doing. And on the way home, I did something that I never did. So obviously I had a foreboding sense. Instead of taking the most direct route to the parking lot to my car, I walked through the emergency department and I heard the words that are, the three worst words that an emergency physician will ever hear. And they are, do you remember? Do you remember that patient you sent home a few hours ago? Occasionally, but not usually, it isn't followed by, well, that person is donating $1 million in your name and thinks you're wonderful. It's usually something really bad happened. And in this case, the patient was brought back moribund, like nearly dead, had a severe hypotensive episode, heart failure, and died about 10 days later. She might have died 10 days later anyway, but the fact is that my mistakes were clear. That was the first time that I was aware that this work is tough and that my mistakes had consequences. If I sank into a depression following, sleeping in, this was altogether different. And it took me many years to realize that it was a shame response that I was feeling.
As I listen to you, in situations where success or failure, life or death, are ones that really impact you. They're not a transaction. They're not a moment. They can send you into these spirals. but you continue to come back and put yourself in those situations because anytime you walk into ER, you've got to make decisions and judgment that are a matter of life and death.
Right.
I'm curious why you kept coming back and drawing from that well, knowing that it has such an impact on you mentally. What
would your advice be? I'm asking rhetorically, that you not do it anymore, or that if you see yourself, if that alternative is running away from challenges, shirking from challenges, or flinching and just saying, nah, that's too much for me. I think that I saw my parents do that for many years. I mean, this is terrible now. I mean, it was part of the litany that the messages that parents feed their children. My mom kept saying, don't be like your father. Like, come on, like he had no good qualities. Come on. That took me a long time to get, but my mom, I ran a race when I was like 6 or 7 years old. Their social club had a picnic, and, if they had their kids, they had events for their kids. And in this race, I took 3 or 4 strides, on your mark, get set, go. I start to run. I realized I'm not going to win because I'm not the fastest, and I stopped. And my mom never let me forget that. She called me a quitter. She said, don't be a quitter. The pathology of that, like, it's not all good. The pathology of that is that you don't know how to quit things that you should quit. I can tell you, Tony, that I have, I'm thinking of a colleague right now. I've been thinking about who are the people I worked with 40 years ago when I first started at Mount Sinai Hospital. And one of them, within 9 months to a year or so, was so beaten down by the very things that you've talked about, the patients that go south, that go sour, the person you send home who comes back way worse or dead, because it happens, because that's real life. She quit and she did something else, and God love her for that. One of the things I had to learn how to do, 2 things, for my head, I had to figure out what I did wrong and not do it the next time. And as I said in the TED Talk is not just a litany of my mistakes. It's a triumph. Because I can't tell you how many people I've saved, because of the mistakes that I made. And that famous person that told me not famous, he was former father-in-law of mine, late father-in-law of mine, said, the one who said, if you can't be the best, be different. He was one of the first people to tell me that, he liked to quote aphorisms, that good judgment comes from experience. And experience comes from bad judgment. You have to make mistakes and you have to rebound from your mistakes. If you don't, you're going nowhere. It's the concept of failing forward. Certainly, the business world has embraced failing forward. But if you live in a shame, if you operate in a shame culture, you don't learn from mistakes because the revelation of those mistakes are by definition shameful. Because they're shameful, you don't want to learn from them because you think the inevitable result of revealing those is that you will be asked to disband. And shame, I think a lot of health professionals become frontline healthcare workers because they are riddled with internalized shame. It's like a bulletproof vest against criticism. That, you sacrifice so much and you're such a you work hard. Look, you were halfway to the parking lot and you realize that you hadn't checked the sodium. So you turn around and you go back and then a family pulls you into the emergency department and says, please help my son. And even though you're supposed to be going home to your family and you're supposed to have dinner and you're tired, you go and you stop and you help them. And instead of going home at 9 o'clock in the evening and missing dinner, you go home at 1 o'clock in the morning and you miss sleep because and everybody says, what a great job. You're a martyr. That's a great, and it all sounds wonderful until you realize how sick it is. It's sick because if you don't take care of yourself, you will not take care of your patients.
Most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about, their final chapter, where they might be living, what their caregiving requirements might be, and personal planning, their financial planning, and then ultimately their estate planning to make sure that they're setting their loved ones that they're leaving behind up for success.
That was Leanne Kaufman speaking. Join me later as she shares what RBC Wealth is doing with their healthy aging initiatives. Stick around because what she has to say matters because it's about you living longer and healthier. Hi, this is Tony Chapman. I want to talk to you about what RBC Wealth Management is doing to support healthy aging. Old age is becoming old news. We're living longer, and planning for our future means we need to integrate health, wellness, and our financial matters. RBC Wealth Management is partnering with leading experts and organizations like the MIT Age Lab, the National Institute on Aging, the Women's Brain Health Initiative, Elder Caring, and the Women's Age Lab. Why? To provide you with comprehensive resources covering every aspect of you aging well. This includes support for your physical and mental health, caregiving, maintaining financial stability, and preparing for later life health issues, ensuring you can age safely and comfortably, and ideally in your own home. With RBC Wealth Management, you create a personalized plan that adapts as your needs change, giving you peace of mind and security. Visit rbcwealthmanagement.com and learn more about healthy aging and start planning for your future. Healthy aging? Well, that matters to you, to me, and to RBC.
I've discovered the antidote to my shame and my path to empathy. It began with me talking about my medical mistakes openly and being a beacon for those who felt ashamed of their mistakes, to say, you are not alone. I have done it, and maybe I've done worse.
You're listening to Chatter That Matters with Tony Chapman, presented by RBC.
My guest today is Dr. Brian Goldman, one of Canada's top medical commentators. He's a host of CBC's award-winning radio show White Coat, Black Art, and he's a host of the podcast The Dose on current affairs in healthcare. I want to talk about care and your book, The Power of Kindness, and it really came about, I guess, from this gentleman, Ruben Rosenblatt.
Yep.
So he brought his wife into ER. So just tell us about what happened and why and how that manifested into a book.
So Ruben's late wife was in the end stages of multiple sclerosis, and she could not speak for herself. She couldn't ambulate. She was receiving, pretty much 24/7 care at home, and her family had reached the point, where they felt they couldn't care for her properly at home, like as most families do. In fact, even today, especially today, now that we have so many people who have loved ones who require 24/7 care, we don't have great home care. We don't have a lot of long-term care facilities. One of the reasons why, we have them transferred to a long-term care facility is that we don't have the support and competence and knowledge and skill necessary to care for them. One of the solutions to that is to teach people how to do it. We're talking 1992. At a time when, Ruben did what every family, or what most families do. They bring their loved one to the emergency department saying, we've reached the end of the road on this. And I was a youngish, smart, but very defensive emergency physician. When they said, this is a situation, I sized it up. My assessment was that my patient was not suffering from severe respiratory distress, wasn't dehydrated, had a loving family. I had already cultivated in myself, or had decided that I was never going to be an emergency physician who, kind of puts my hands on my hips and says no to people's requests. If I can make it happen, I'll make it happen. And so I referred her almost immediately to the internal medicine team because of triage. Because the most urgent patient gets whatever order they arrive, the most urgent patient gets treated first. I made that referral early in my shift, and like 5, 6, 7 hours later, she still hadn't been seen by internal medicine. And every time I walked by the room, somebody from the family, Ruben or his kids, would ask, when's my mom getting a bed? I don't know. Can you estimate when my mom's getting a bed? When she sees the internal medicine team. And I left, and I'd come back an hour later, or I'd walk by and they'd pull me in and they'd say, when's my mom going to see the internal medicine team? I don't know. Can you estimate when she'll see it? And this went on and on and on. And at one point, when one of the family members asked if I had actually made the referral, like skeptical, I did something that again, I broke one of my rules. I snapped at her. I said, I did what you asked. And I walked away. And she got seen eventually by internal medicine. She got admitted. She died several weeks later, about 3 weeks later, not unexpectedly. And then a few months after that, I received this beautifully handwritten note from Ruben Rosenblatt, a letter. Like, who writes a letter these days? And the words that burned, that made me kind of burn with kind of shame, there's that word again, was that he invited me to meet with his family to talk about what happened, to see if there was any residual kindness lurking under all that brusqueness that I demonstrated that day. So they weren't talking about my competence. They were talking about my demeanor and my kindness. First of all, if somebody accuses you of incompetence or negligence, that's actually arguable. That's almost always arguable. But when a family accuses you of unkindness, they've got you busted. They know, because everybody knows kindness and unkindness. Eventually I met with the family, and, my chief offered to come with me. I was appreciative of that, but I thought, they don't want to see the Politburo. They don't want to be told we did the best we could, and, we have competing priorities, and where people walk away feeling more damaged than feeling as if whatever they said landed. So I met with them alone. I remember the room. I remember the time and place. They told me all the things that I wish I'd known had I been present on that day with them, instead of being, I reckon as I look back, I was defensive. I didn't like saying, I don't know. I didn't like being to their questions. I didn't like being powerless, not being able to snap my fingers and make things happen. And which, emergency physicians are almost by definition powerless. We have to beg people sometimes to see patients, and, the residents get younger and younger, and they get more and more condescending over the years. Although, there is power in being an older and attending physician. When all the attendings know you very well, that if you pick up the phone and call them, they're not going to defend the resident. They're going to go to the resident and say, hey, how come you're not seeing Goldman's patient? But we had, the family cried. I cried. We had a really good session. And it's really interesting. I didn't remember this, but one of the sons remembered that I said to them, I'll never forget this conversation. Verbally, I empathized with them. Emotionally, I had no idea what they were going through. It was so far beyond my experience of having a mother with end stage multiple sclerosis and maybe providing care and not being able to talk to her. It was only about 10 years later, with my mother having dementia and my father spending the best 15 years of his retirement life looking after her, that I could finally empathize with that family. And especially on the night my dad died. He died at a hospital in Toronto. He took care of my mother until she was removed from the home because it was either stay at home or die, or go to long-term care and live. And it broke my father's heart. And 6 months later, he had his first heart attack, and he developed heart failure. And the last 2 or 3 years of his life were not kind. And on the last day of his life, I had worked all night in the emergency department the night before. He was brought to the emergency department. I'd had a difficult conversation with somebody not related to medicine, related to my broadcasting. And so it was not a good day. It was a really, really bad week for a whole bunch of personal reasons. And I stayed with him. And at 10:30 at night, my dad wanted us to all go home. We were gathered around his bedside. He still had smoldering angina, and I should have realized that was the end of it. But my judgment was off because I was more sleep deprived than I'd ever been in my life. And I remember walking out the door with a foreboding sense, and then kind of stepping back and kissing him on the cheek and saying, I love you. And it was the only time in my life that I said, I love you. He never said it to me. I went to bed. I don't remember my head hitting the pillow. And the next thing I know, I'm being shaken awake. I can hear my name being called 2 or 3 times. And it's my wife, Tamara, and she's got a stricken look on her face. And I said, he's gone, isn't he? And I remember going back to the hospital with my sister and brother-in-law. Actually, the first look on my dad's face, it was a placid look, like the struggle was over, and it had been a horrible time for him. And then the cardiologist comes in with a nurse. I recognized myself in him. That how I was with that other family was how he was with me at that moment. He was defensive. He was thinking, I got Goldman's dad as my patient, and I couldn't keep him alive for one night. I remember not wanting that cardiologist to be in the room with me anymore. I was done. My father was gone. Nothing was going to change that. And I remember saying to him, thank you for looking after him. That was the first time that I understood what the other family was going through. And that's what set me on the journey to write the book. That was the engine that set me on the world to meet kind people, to ask myself the question, am I a kind soul? or am I I don't know if I can say this, am I an asshole? Is that what I've become at that? And I realized that the answer was more nuanced, that I was so shame riddled and defensive that I couldn't get outside of my own head. My own head was in the way of being in the moment and kind, but you have to purge yourself of that. You have to, and one way to do it is to first of all say, live with your mistakes and accept that you make mistakes. One of the things I discovered early on is that if you tell a family what actually happened, 9 times out of 10, they will like you better.
It's interesting. I had Miles Nadell on my show, and he's of the same age you are and I am, and asking him kind of, in terms of how he wants to be remembered and thought of. And it's interesting, for a guy that has done so much, he said, I just want to be known as a kind person.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about Joanne, because your sister, who you were very close with earlier in the show, she said she was your best friend. And you wrote this incredible article that really moved me, titled, I'm the last surviving member of my family. And within it, you included some pictures of the two of you that I thought were just beautiful. You could tell that you were siblings and soulmates. And talk to me about, because it seems like every time throughout your journey, these experiences have truly changed you, moved you, sharpened the way you're thinking, opened up your heart, opened up your mind. And I'm just curious to what did Joanne's, when she was here with you, bring to your life, and what did her passing give to you?
My sister was in many respects an opposite to me, but she also showed remarkable capacity for growth and development. She found some of the subjects at school harder than I did. I was probably better at math and science than she was. Certainly, one of the things that she did that I said I was lonely, and she had a million friends. She had a great facility for nurturing friendships and remembering everybody's names. She had a kind of a problematic relationship with our father. My sister, who could be argumentative, had a lot of arguments with my dad. They seemed to be the entertainment of our house. Arguments, like knockdown, drag out arguments, yelling and screaming matches. My sister absorbed a lot of negative messages when she was growing up. Like, you're no good at this, you're no good at that. She started off as a confident girl and got beaten down in her teenage years, I thought. I can't change that. One of her enduring wonderful qualities, she had a capacity for loyalty, which was amazing. She could see the best in everybody, including me. That and the shared experience that she and I had from growing up, it's something that I think is often underrated. That the relationship with the sibling is so important to affirming who you are and reflecting on who you are and how you've changed over the years. She was always there at my, in the good times and in the bad times. Like, she didn't tell me enough about the struggles that she had raising a son who lived the first 17 months of his life in an orphanage in Romania at the tail end of the Ceausescu regime, where they were brutal and abusive and horrible to babies at that time. She was always the person who knew what resources to try to tap into, whether it was psychologists or other kinds of play therapists, art therapists, that kind of thing. So when we asked her for advice, she was always an encyclopedia of suggestions. And I talk about her in my talks these days, and I have a photo of her. I went to her work on one of her last days at work. Maybe it was the last day. I don't know. I don't think it was the last day. She wasn't cleaning out her desk. And I saw how well she was received. She was a counselor at a shelter for women who had experienced domestic violence in downtown Toronto, Robertson House. And she was well liked, and she was a counselor's counselor. She was very good at juggling commitments, and you could see her walking through the facility, which is residential as well as a treatment facility, and having to kind of put out fires from one end of the hallway to another. And she hated, that the root of the work that she did was relationships with women who had experienced domestic violence, helping them through a very difficult transition of their lives. And it had morphed into outcomes. Treat them and street them, get them out in the street, get them housing and get them out of here and get the next one in. And she hated that. And she retired. And No sooner did she retire than she started showing signs of dementia, symptoms and signs of dementia. There was no time for me to feel how I felt, which was utter despair. Like this person who you think is going to be with you for the next 20 or 25 years, and you're going to raise your kids together, and you're going to go to happy events together. You know, we had just buried our parents, one after the other, 2013, 2014. And by 2016, 2017, she just wasn't right. And, her life after that was horrible. She lived in long-term care for the last 13 months of her life, and the last 7 months in a long-term care facility. She lost her capacity for words, for speech. For a while, she had fluent aphasia, where she would say sentences that made sense to her, but made no sense to us. And it was very hard to know what was on her mind. The last 4-syllable word that she uttered, I remember. She had a beloved caregiver who, an outside caregiver who was a PSW, but was a nurse in the Philippines, became qualified as a nurse in Canada. And we kept her on. You have this sense of accomplishment that you get a meal into your loved one, which is ridiculous, because if they don't want to be fed, then the accomplishment is not the feeding, which is your way of making them live another day when they may not want to live another day. She hated being fed by me. She actually didn't like being fed by Christine. I was talking to her and I was empathizing with her. I said, you don't like this. And I said, you're angry about this. And she mustered up the will to give a 4-syllable word to describe the predicament of being fed by 2 adults. The word was embarrassing. This woman who used to be able to speak, who could no longer speak, 3 weeks before she died, referred to being fed by us as embarrassing. In the last couple of years of her life, as I took over her affairs and became her power of attorney, I had to become the Joanne Whisperer. I had to, be able to try to provide emotional support for her. It was a really hard time. And it was only after she died that, I mourned her death and her absence. And then I realized I had never mourned her dying. You think that somebody with dementia might live another 2 or 3 years. We got her into a long-term care facility, and then 2 months later, she was admitted to hospital with aspiration pneumonia. And that's the beginning of the end. When you aspirate, it means you can no longer control food prevent it from going into your lungs. If that happens, you're at risk of choking to death at any time. You're at risk of aspiration pneumonia and fever and respiratory distress. She had all of that. The hospital treated her well enough that she eventually got back to the long-term care. And we went through a number of episodes of aspiration. Then she got COVID. And that was the end. And I didn't realize how much how much despair I felt at being unable to stop this freight train, that this train was going to go over the canyon, was going to fall into the canyon. I guess as a physician, as an emergency physician, I'm not a palliative care doc, that I'm always thinking there's always another solution. There's always another fix. And accepting the fact that there wasn't was really hard on me on that time. I'm better than I was when I wrote the article, but I was despairing at being the last surviving member of my family and feeling that there was no more, that I no longer had somebody who knew what it was like when we grew up with our parents, what our relationship was really like, not the projected image of our family that's out there, but how as we really are.
Such a powerful story. But I do want to also get to, I described you earlier as, Larry David, but this new one is now Superman and Clark Kent. And, there's this sort of Superman ER doctor at night compartmentalizing, and then Clark Kent, the journalist, the radio host of White Coat, Black Art, CBC Radio One, podcaster. How important is it for you to have that left brain and right brain? Because the way you described yourself earlier on in life is, science and mathematics. And I think the quote was, he'd study for a blood test. And the emotive side of you that comes out when you're talking about the healthcare system, and you're talking about, even the changes, and why are we still handwritten notes and file cabinets that overflow. So tell me how both of these things happen inside one person, because to me, it really is very different careers.
Yeah. And well, I guess the simplistic answer is that I made one feed into the other. I'm not complete without both. I don't want to leave the impression that I'm just a fortunate person who can dabble in a whole bunch of things, can dabble in maths and sciences and dabble in English and history and politics and all that and all that kind of stuff. For too long, medicine has encompassed the left brain and not enough of the right brain. Although remember, the right brain also is involved with visualization, and there are specialties and subspecialties of medicine like radiology that depend on the right brain. It's never all or nothing. I would say, medicine should not only be practiced with the head, but with the heart. And that means empathizing. We have, as if you read The Power of Kindness, we are all, evolution has gifted us with the genetic heritage of being able to empathize with others. That's how we build civilizations. That's how we take care of our families. That's how we take care of other people's kids. And without which we'd have killed each other. And we have these giant frontal lobes that are well equipped with the capacity for kindness and empathy, except when we are under unbelievable stress. The more we have stress torqued up in our society, the more that takes our frontal lobes offline, and we resort to our primitive reflexes. And in our primitive reflexes, we have an uncanny ability to divide the world into us and them, into the self and the other, my friends and my enemies. And if you look around, that's what we're doing. That's what American politics is doing. That, Canadian politics has not been that like that. We could be heading in the same direction, where we fear the barbarians at the gate. We fear the immigrant, because the immigrant's going to come and take over and destroy our lives. The stress that we're under security stress, we're under housing stress, economic stress. The answer to reviving our natural tendency to empathy, to be empathic and kind to others, is to address the stresses. And so societies that do a better job of taking care of people, redistributing wealth, it's not rocket science. That's the way to do it. That's what a kind society does. And the more you leave every person for themselves and speak disparagingly of people who are disadvantaged, the more that society is in trouble. For me, why do I do it? Because it makes sense. Because it's the only way. It's the way that I think I've become a better person. And by listening to that inner voice, and that inner voice isn't coming from my left brain. That voice, I've often said that it was a guardian angel that made me sleep in that morning and miss rounds. You could also argue that it finally became evident to me, and that I needed a dramatic gesture as an exit from a plan that would have been disastrous. I just think you're not a complete person if you don't have both.
I always wrap up my show with my 3 takeaways, and you've offered so many gems, but I think the first one is just something you just talked about, and something we should all be paying more attention to, that the more stress we are under, or we feel the world is under, the less empathetic we are. We become much more of a divide and conquer society. And I think that's just a powerful insight. And I think those insights come from my second takeaway from you, which is the beginning of the show, where you said, I like to follow the breadcrumbs. I like to go deeper than the surface. I like to listen generously. I like to observe. And I think that's another powerful lesson for us, because if we just get caught up in this snackable content and this roar of negativity coming at us, we're just going to continue to hide with what we think is within our comfort zone and attack those that we feel don't belong there. And then the final one is just the importance of feeling the pain, whether it's mistakes you make, people that you lose along the way, situations that happen to you that, when people just say, buckle up, slap you in the back and say, get over it, it's the wrong advice. That the most important thing you need to do is to feel that pain, embrace it, maybe even learn from it. You've offered so much today in this show, and I can certainly understand why you are as talented you are with your show, White Coat, Black Art, with your podcast, The Dose. I'll put links to both. I'm going to put links to the TED Talk, which I listened to every word of it. I haven't read Power of Kindness yet, but I'm going to now. And I just want to thank you for being part of Chatter That Matters.
Well, thank you, Tony. You know, you've conducted some great conversations, and certainly you've interviewed some people who've had even more dramatic stories than I have. And thank you for doing what you're doing.
My name is Brian Goldman. I am a redefined physician. I'm human. I make mistakes. I'm sorry about that. But I strive to learn one thing that I can pass on to other people. I do remember.
Joining me now is Leanne Kaufman, the president and CEO of RBC Royal Trust. Leanne's made several appearances on my show, and I often go to her when it comes to matters of life and money. Leanne, welcome back to Chatter That Matters.
It's great to be back, Tony. Thanks for having me.
Now, you've got a big title, and it's obviously attached to RBC Royal Trust, but what I'm most fascinated about is some of your posts in recent weeks and some of your adventures in recent months, all about aging well. So talk to me about why is that a passion of yours? And what does that have to do with RBC Royal Trust?
Well, I mean, on the personal note, of course, we should all be concerned about aging well. And I'm over 50, so I've got a selfish vested interest in this. But from a business perspective, Royal Trust, given that we act as corporate executor, corporate power of attorney, we've always dealt with people in later stages of life and end of life. You know, it's a natural fit, especially with the demographics that we're seeing. People are living longer. There's more and more people living to 100 and beyond, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're living well. And we just wanted to start bringing attention to this issue for people my age and older to really, make sure they're able to maximize.
And selfishly, I actually benefit from it on Chatter That Matters because you're always meeting these really interesting people and suggesting that they would make great guests. And one of them obviously is my guest on this episode, Brian Goldman. Why do you feel what he's doing is of importance to Canadians as we look through the passing of time? Generally,
of course, Dr. Goldman's, had a public voice for a long time around all things related to health and medicine and making it really accessible for the general public. But he's also been very public about his own caregiving journey, looking after his sister. He's been focused on issues related to powers of attorney and the legal side of and caregiving side of these journeys as well. So I know that he is just an advocate. He's a great speaker when it comes to all things medical, makes them very consumable, but also speaks from a place of personal experience and lived experience.
A lot of this is about matters of the heart, caring for others, caring for ourselves. You also talked a little bit about money matters. And I just want to close this part of the show with any advice you can give to people, because we tend to think that we're immortal. We tend to put off a lot of the dotting I's and crossing T's. But if there's one or two thoughts you can leave my audience with in terms of getting your money matters in order so that you can focus on what really matters, your health, what would those thoughts be?
Well, it all comes back to planning. And whether that's planning for your health, planning for how you're going to live your life in your later years, wealth is part of that, because your finances are inextricably linked to some of the choices and goals that you'll have. And so most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about, their final chapter, where they might be living, what their caregiving requirements might be. But they, we really want people to do that and to factor this in as part of their personal planning, their financial planning, and then ultimately their estate planning to make sure that they're setting their loved ones that they're leaving behind up for success.
Leanne, I can be personal testament to that because someone very close to me did leave us sooner than we imagined. As you're dealing with personal grief, having to deal with these money matters was something that no one asked for, nobody wanted, and quite honestly, no one had any idea what to do about it. So sage advice for all, and I appreciate you joining me in Chatter That Matters.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Chatter That Matters has been a presentation of RBC.
It's Tony Chapman. Thanks for listening. Let's chat soon.